My talk is entitled, What Does the Science of Learning Tell Us About Learning Styles? I'm excited to talk to you about that topic today. It's one that I care a lot about and I'm interested in. So I believe that the science of learning really can help us teach and learn more effectively. And that's one reason why I love studying it. I think students and educators have a real challenge in front of them to learn everything they need to learn, to teach everything they need to teach. And so anything that we can do to better understand how to make that happen better and more smoothly, I'm all for, I'm into it. And a lot of work in the science of learning and educational psychology involves lab experiments, and those are fine. We learn things from that. I do some lab experiments, they're okay. But a lot of the work that we do is in classrooms, and that's where the rubber hits the road, right? That's where we have to make sure that whatever we do works with actual students and actual teachers in actual classrooms. And that's the work that I love. And that's why I'm so glad to talk to you today, because the work that you do and will do in the future is essential to people, our country, our world. And so I'm really grateful for all the work that you have been doing and will be doing. So I'm curious as to what you have heard about our topic today. So let's start here. And I want to encourage you to share, to speak up, to put things in the chat, which I'm going to open because it disappeared for me. So what are learning styles? What have you heard about learning styles? Feel free to unmute, raise your hand, and or pop something in the chat.
Learning styles can be visual or hearing. There's different ways people learn.
Yeah, thank you, Nas. Yeah, absolutely. So there's different types, right? So there's visual, there's hearing or auditory. Great. I see Melanie says it's preference. Other thoughts? By the way, so here's a sub question for you. When an educator asks, are there any questions or any thoughts, how long do you think they wait on average before they move on? Any guesses? Joshua says 3 seconds. 5 to 10, 10, not long enough. Yes, okay. Lauren, of course, Lauren, you know. That's right, she knows. The answer is about 2.2 seconds. And that's not enough time for anyone to think carefully about the question, right? You almost have to have a question or an answer in mind to produce it in 2.2 seconds. So I always wait 10 seconds when I ask if there are questions or comments. It feels really weird because we're all used to like, any questions? Okay, we're used to that. But I count to 10 in my head, the Zen 10. I love it, Carlton. Nice. I wait until 10 just to see if there are any questions. And very often, I'll just kind of vamp and talk like I am now. And then all of a sudden, some good ideas pop up. And so I'm happy to see in the chat that people are still sharing things like adapting to your crowd, hands-on learning, environmental learning. These are all really good suggestions. And that gets to the second question that I had in my slides, which was what kinds of learning styles are there? And then I think the third question that's really relevant is how can learning styles help us teach and help students learn? So what are your thoughts on that? How do they help us? So yeah, that's the threshold for when silence starts to get awkward. That's right, it is. Repeat the question, sure. So we know that there are these things called learning styles. How do they help us learn and teach? And so Kira, please go ahead.
I would say that kids come from different backgrounds and they all learn differently. So to be able to have different teaching styles, you're able to connect to different students that are diverse and are receptible to that type of knowledge or learning style.
Yeah, I love that, right? So it gets to the heart of what I think a lot of people find really enticing about learning styles is that students are different. And we want to recognize that students are different. They have different strengths, they have different challenges, and we want to try to tailor our instruction to kind of help them be all they can be, right? To maximize their capacities. I see that Bien said knowing learning styles helps educators adapt to students with varying styles as well. There are tools for differentiation. Love that word. I see if you know someone is accustomed to one style, you can tweak the information to better fit the recipient. Great. Good. These are all wonderful suggestions and exactly what I think about and what I hear about when people talk about learning styles. So I think we're right on track. And indeed, there are lots of learning styles out there, right? So people have mentioned visual learning styles and auditory learning styles. There's different models of learning styles. You can see the one here on your screen has verbal and visual and also musical and auditory and physical, kinesthetic, all these other ones. There are different ways to group learning styles. There's different kind of ideas about it. I think the most popular one is probably what some people call the VAK model of learning styles: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And it says what we've been talking about so far. The idea behind learning styles is that if I teach some content to someone who's a visual learner, if I do it in a visual way, they should learn that content better than if I do it in other ways. And people have kind of a dominant learning style. And so if you know that, you should present all content to them in that particular way. And this is the foundation for what people call the matching hypothesis. And what that says is that, as I just said, there are different kinds of learners, right? So visual learners and tactile learners. And if someone is a visual learner, then the way that they learn best is by presenting all information visually. A tactile learner, someone who learns, by touching and doing and moving, they should learn things based upon, learning and moving and touching and doing things. That's the matching. You want to match the instructional content and format to the ways in which someone learns. That's the matching hypothesis behind learning styles. And the thing I really like about what we've been talking about is, and Kira mentioned this, teachers and educators want to help students succeed, right? We want to do everything we can to help put students in a position to be successful. And as she said, people have different backgrounds, they have different things that they know, and very often it's really helpful to try to help students understand things from a place of familiarity. Help them understand things based upon the ways they receive it. So that's a really fantastic thing, and we want to encourage that. We want teachers to be nimble and to have a lot of tools in their toolbox so that they can meet students where they are at and provide students what they need to be successful. But there's a big however here. And the however is this. We've done a lot of research, and there's absolutely no empirical evidence to suggest that people actually have learning styles in the way we've been describing them. And that's often for many people kind of a wow moment. And so I want to acknowledge that. And if you're someone who has heard a lot about learning styles, maybe you're someone who was told you have a learning style, maybe someone diagnosed you with a learning style, I don't want you to feel bad. There was a time where I thought I had a learning style too. Nobody should be ashamed of that. But what I can tell you is that hundreds and hundreds of scholars who have really wanted to try to find evidence that learning styles exist haven't been able to find it. And we're going to talk about why and what that means. And there's good news at the end of this. One thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to take something away from you and leave you with nothing. I'm going to give you other things that you can do, all the differentiation that you have talked about that being so important that I agree with. So learning styles are kind of like zombies in that they've been popular since the 70s. They're scientifically inaccurate and they just won't die. And there's reasons for that, right? Most of the people that I talk to out in the world, when I mention what I do, that I study the science of learning, they usually say, oh, like learning styles. So it's a very common thing. It's still out there a lot. So why is it the case that learning styles don't seem to be a thing? Well, it's absolutely true that students learn and perform differently, and we want to honor that, acknowledge it. It's not the case that some students are, kind of learning, quote unquote, better than others, but rather there's differences that we as educators need to take into consideration to help them be successful. But the reality is that everyone learns best when they learn using multiple different representations of content. So that's the good news. The thing I like to say sometimes is that the good news is that we have all the learning styles. So people learn best when they can see, hear, and interact with content. So what you can see on this slide is, so there's a student and they're working with a molecule that's a physical representation of that molecule. You can see that a teacher is talking to the student and explaining things in an auditory way. There are pictures of molecules that can share information that maybe you can't represent so well in a physical object, or might be hard to visualize if you just hear it. And when someone's trying to understand chemical molecules and how they work, it's really great if you can present things in multiple modalities, visually, auditorily, maybe physically, etc. And the more different ways that someone can encounter an idea, the more likely it is that they'll latch onto it, they'll connect with it, and they'll understand it. So for those of you who have done a lot of thinking about, how do I differentiate my instruction for learning styles, that's not time that wasn't well spent. But what we want to do is use all of those different ways with all students as much as we can. And there are some ideas that really are best taught in a particular way. And so you see on here a picture of a map. It'd be pretty difficult for me with an auditory learner to just describe verbally what's on the map. That student, I think, would have a hard time understanding. Whereas if I just show them a map, well, it's going to be a lot easier for them to learn. And so this kind of violates the matching hypothesis of learning styles. It's not the case that auditory learners have to learn everything by hearing it. It's not the case that visual learners have to learn everything by seeing it. It does sometimes depend upon content also. Some kinds of content is just better represented in certain ways. And so, if a student's learning a second language, imagine trying to teach that student with nothing but visual materials. That would be really, really difficult. Students need to speak. They need to hear a second language. And so these are just examples of how the learning styles matching hypothesis doesn't really kind of hold up, but there's been lots of empirical work kind of testing students, providing them instruction, using their learning style, and there's just no difference in their performance compared to other ways of teaching them. Now, I want to stop for a second and just kind of check out the chat, which I haven't been able to attend to as well as I would like to, and just ask, does this matter, right? So does it matter if learning styles aren't quote unquote real? What do you think, and what questions do you have? So Julie says, yes, it does matter because students use these as a crutch. I'd love to hear more about that.
No
problem.
Sorry, I'm with a colleague and we're watching it together. Students will blame that, my teacher didn't teach it this way, and that's my learning style, so that's why I didn't learn it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so some students do use it as an explanation for why they might be struggling, and sometimes that involves blaming a teacher. That's not ideal. Good. Learning style should not confine one student to one type of learning. Melanie, I like what you wrote there. If the student is learning still efficiently, it can vary. Yep, Nathaniel, it could be a combination of all. It does matter because teachers need to recognize that everyone learns differently. That's absolutely true, and I want to talk more about that. Michael, I see your hands up, please.
Hi, what's up, man? So I just wanted to add on that learning styles. To me, it sometimes matters, sometimes it doesn't, because how I was taught was that learning styles kind of helps me to figure out, how do I teach these kids how do I teach a lesson, because I'm going to be a gym teacher in the future. So a learning style is kind of what I need at this point, just so I understand what I'm doing. This is also what I was taught by my old middle school teacher as well, who's helping me out with the gym course. So again, when asking the question if the learning styles aren't real, stuff like that, I'd say it kind of depends.
Okay.
Based on how you teach in the class, if you catch my drift.
Yeah, it sounds like you're using learning styles as a way to think about different ways of presenting information or getting students engaged. And
Yeah.
I like that a lot. And that's something that I encourage people to do. So thank you, Michael. That's really helpful. Caitlin, I see your hands up also.
So I guess my question is that like, are you still saying that there is like maybe not a learning style for individuals per se, but like learning styles in regards to when we're covering a certain topic or subject? Because I mean, there are like a lot of the examples you gave, like I think it is more explicit towards like, oh, if we're, trying to learn something on the mat, it's impossible to do in an auditory way. But like for something more general that you can also do by watching a video, like a tutorial video on how to build something from IKEA versus like actually seeing someone model it for you and then you doing it physically, I feel like people can still learn both ways. Someone might pick it up from a video, but for me personally, I know I would need to actually like physically do it for me to be like, okay, this is step by step what I do. So would you say that like there are still learning styles for certain tasks and subjects, just not individuals then?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, Caitlin. So thank you. What I'd say is that people don't have learning styles, but learning styles are a way to think about how to present information in different ways. And as you said, some kinds of information, there might be a particular way to present it that's really useful for a lot of students, like a map looking at it. But for other students and other kinds of content, for other kinds of content, it might be that you can present it in multiple ways. And that's when this idea of varying your representation, making a visual representation, maybe an auditory representation, a physical representation, that's really great. Because as you said, different students will kind of connect with different representations. And that's great. That helps them learn. And so you've allowed us to move really well into the next part. I want to hear from Melanie, and then we're going to kind of move on. So Melanie, please feel free to share.
Hello. So I wrote in the chat that students would absolutely need exposure. They learn by exposure, and exposure leads to more information and understanding themselves and the world around them. So the professor I have this semester was telling us that it's just a preference of what we like. It's not actually set in stone. And a child or a student might be, I'm a visual learner only. I don't need this, and they will be stuck on this mindset that they can't learn any other way, which is very detrimental to how they retain information. And any exposure for anything else would be detrimental to their education. So having the learning style is definitely a foundation that we can be set on, but it's something that we don't have to keep steady. It's definitely changing. It's definitely changing over time.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree, right? So we want to, and this has come up several times, we want to make sure that we're presenting information in as many modalities as possible so students can find the one for that particular content that works for them. What we want to avoid are students who, and I think Caitlin said this, students who say, I only learn one way. And that's the real problem. And so this cartoon kind of illustrates that. And the cartoon says, as we start a new school year, Mr. Smith, I just want you to know that I'm an abstract sequential learner and trust that you'll conduct yourself accordingly. So this gets back to something that someone said earlier about kind of blaming teachers. And this is supposed to be a cartoon to make people laugh, but I can tell you this happened to me. I taught an undergraduate science of learning class, and on the first day, a very nice guy came up to me, one of the students, and he said, Dr. Green, I just want to let you know that I'm a kinesthetic learner, and so I can't learn in class. You're showing me things and you're talking to me, and that's just not how I learn. But I know I'm supposed to be here, so I'm just going to sit in the back and I'm just going to kind of chill. I'm not going to bother anybody. But I'm just going to kind of space out, and I'll just figure it out for myself later. And, I was able to talk to that student and tell him how he was missing all these opportunities for learning because he thought that he was a particular kind of learner, and that was the only way he could learn. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid students thinking that they can't learn in a variety of different ways, because of course they can. And so I think these learning styles feel real because all of us, many of us probably have had this kind of aha moment where we're struggling, or we're working with a student who is struggling, and they're hearing us talk maybe, and they're reading something in a text and they're just not getting it. And then you draw a picture and suddenly they realize, suddenly it all clicks for them. And in that moment, I think it's easy to infer, oh, well, I must be a visual learner. That's a very understandable inference, but it's not accurate. And what I worry about is when students extrapolate that and say, well, I have to learn everything visually, because I think they'll miss out on a lot of really wonderful learning opportunities if they think that. So what we really want to do here is differentiate, right? And that's the word that came up earlier that I really love. Differentiation is wonderful. Teachers that do it are doing a wonderful service for their students. It's not easy, but it can be done. I just don't want you differentiating on learning styles. I'm going to suggest there's some different ways to differentiate. So, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want to, because I don't want to take too much of Carlton's time, but there are ways to differentiate based upon prior knowledge. So we learn new things primarily by connecting new ideas to things we've already learned. And so as a teacher, if you know your student, what your students know, you can then more easily connect new ideas to what they already know. So understanding your students' prior knowledge is really important. There's something called funds of knowledge that expands that idea, not just about academic knowledge, but students' background, their experiences, their culture, their interests. And if you can connect new ideas in school to students' funds of knowledge, that's another really wonderful way to help them understand. And different students bring different funds of knowledge to the classroom. And so the more you can do that, you can differentiate your instruction to their funds of knowledge, the easier it will be for them to learn. The same thing is true for interest and motivation. So they have students have different interests and different motivators. If you can differentiate to that, that's a wonderful way to do it. And then, of course, scaffolding to kind of what kinds and the amount of knowledge people have is also really wonderful. None of this is easy. I don't mean to suggest that this is simple. This takes a lot of time. And of course, the larger and more diverse the class, the harder it can be for a teacher to differentiate to all the students. There's only so many minutes in an hour. But the more that we can kind of acknowledge these ways of differentiating, the better we can do helping students succeed. All of this falls within a larger area of scholarship called personalization. I'm not going to talk to you about that today or try to explain this very complicated graphic, but if you're interested in learning more about this whole area of scholarship and how you kind of tailor learning environments to students' characteristics and help them succeed, that's a whole area of scholarship that's really fascinating, and I encourage you to check out. So in sum, learning styles aren't real, but differentiation is, and it's really good. And I hope that you do it. I just don't want you differentiating on learning styles because I don't want you indirectly suggesting to students that they can only learn one way. Students have preferences and there's certain kinds of content that might be better represented in one modality or another. But in most cases, most students benefit when they can experience content in more than one way. There's some other other myths that we could talk about, but we don't have time to. I'll just share with you the left-right brain thing, not really a thing. The idea that students are digital natives, also not true. We can't multitask. Our brains do one thing at a time. And when we multitask, we're kind of fighting our brain in that. And there's some ideas out there, and Carlton knows much more about this than I do, but there's an idea out there that extrinsic motivation is bad. And that's an overly simplistic and not quite accurate way of thinking about it. I can't imagine being intrinsically motivated about everything in school. That's not realistic. There are kinds of extrinsic motivation and certain conditions in school where extrinsic motivation can be a good thing. And so that's something else that we can talk about in the future. Finally, there are ways to design instruction based upon the science of learning that we could also talk about sometime in the future. Again, I'm not going to explain this complicated graphic to you, but I can guarantee you in about 20 minutes, we could talk about it and you'd understand it and would really help your instruction. So if you're interested in these ideas, here are some resources that you can access. The Why Don't Students Like School book is really wonderful. It's a great read. It's very quick. It's very friendly. Same with Powerful Teaching. That's also a really quick, fun read. The book on the end there is my book about self-regulation. That's less of a fun read, but hopefully mildly entertaining. But also, if you're interested in the idea of self-regulation, will help you understand that. So I won't take too much time, but I'm happy to take any questions, thoughts, challenges, etc. But thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you, and thank you for all you're doing for our students.
Dr. Green, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. And I love that there's been such a rich conversation in the chat and that there's been some Q&A already. We have about 5 minutes and still to have time for Dr. Fung's talk. What questions would you like to bring to Dr. Green? Go ahead, Caitlin.
So I feel like you kind of cover this a little bit, but I'm just, I guess like in one like statement, because you just mentioned you had a student who came up to you and was like, hey, like I learn only this way. How would you address, I guess, a parent or student that comes up to you and says that? Because I don't want to like sound dismissing that, like,
Sure.
I'm saying, oh no, what you're thinking is wrong, but how would you exactly address that in like that short time frame that you have to talk to a parent or student about that?
That is such a great question. And Caitlin, I'm so glad you framed it as not being condescending or dismissive, because we do not want to do that at all. What I typically do with students is say, you know, I'm really glad that you're thinking carefully about how you learn. And I, as an educator, want to know that. I want to know what you think. I want to know what helps you. I want to try to do what I can to kind of meet you where you're at. However, I want to let you know that, in fact, you might be limiting yourself, because there isn't evidence out there that people have just one learning style. And I can talk to you more about that, but let's try some different ways of engaging with information. And I'll bet you find that the more ways you engage with it, the better you'll understand it. And then we kind of go from there. But it's a tricky conversation. And I'll tell you, there was a time where I think people like me were maybe a little condescending in how they talked about it. Oh, learning styles, how could you think that? That's not good. Right? That's not healthy, because it's very understandable that people have this belief. They shouldn't feel ashamed or foolish for having it. We just want to help them adopt a different belief, because it'll help them learn in the long term. Eric, I think I saw your hand next.
Yes, so I just had a question. Under the assumption that you know everything about your students as far as like learning style, who prefers visual, auditory, any different learning style that they prefer, would a teacher or professor be able to put together a perfect lesson plan or a unit, even with that knowledge? Theoretically speaking, I would assume somebody would be left out.
Yeah, differentiation is tough, because every student is an individual, and we all bring different backgrounds and experiences and strengths and challenges to the classroom. So again, this is a practical challenge that I'm not going to sugarcoat. It is really challenging. And when you have a classroom that's really diverse in terms of those factors, it can be difficult to differentiate for everyone. I think what we want to try to do is find the things that are most likely to help the most people and try to differentiate in that way, and then create supports and other kinds of opportunities, either through lesson planning or other kinds of supports, to get to those students who, for whatever reason, they didn't connect with today's lesson. And what are some ways in which we can do that? And again, I don't want to put on rose-colored glasses here or kind of be toxic, have a toxic positivity about this. It can be really hard. And I don't think it's fair to ask teachers to differentiate for all students all the time perfectly. That's just not humanly possible. But it's about trying to create lessons that do a good job of presenting information in multiple ways that hopefully help most students succeed. And then you can kind of follow up as you're able and needed. So my screen just went a little haywire. Sorry. I think there's a hand up, but I can't tell who. Something just went. Just go ahead and start talking. I'm sorry if something strange has happened.
Jeff, it's Heidi Andrade. I have
a
question.
Heidi.
I have a question and a comment, but I also know that I'm not your intended audience. So if you'd like to take a question from somebody else, I will just make a quick comment that I strongly encourage everybody to read the brief article that I dropped in the chat. It affirms everything you just said about learning styles, which is that there's no research that shows that teaching to learning styles actually improves teaching. But there's also, this article is also about a historical analysis of where the learning styles concept came from, and it's pretty deeply racist. And so if you need any more ammo against learning styles, look at that article. It's very readable, very short. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Heidi, thank you so much. I appreciate you
Thank you.
sharing that. Yes, that sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, at
So
this
Bradley-
time,
Yep.
we're at 12:50, so I think it makes sense to transition. Thanks, everybody, for the really substantive questions about learning styles. And thanks again for the presentation, Dr. Green. Let me turn it over to you, Dr. Fong.
Okay, great. Thank you again for having us, for having me. Let me go ahead and see if I could share. How are we doing? Looks good? Okay,
Looks great.
wonderful. I, as Jeff alluded to, I am a motivation scholar. And recently I've been interested in something called motivational regulation. And well, not recently. I think I always was fascinated with how I was motivated. I think I was always curious as a college student, as a high school student, even now as a professor, like what motivates me and what types of things can I do to enhance my motivation? Because let's face it, we're not always motivated all the time, right? We're sometimes bored, or we're disengaged, or we're too tired to really do anything. And it's in these moments where I myself have wondered, just personally, like, what are some ways I can really enhance my motivation? And so if you're like me, you might be wondering, okay, yes, I'm in the same situation. What can I do? And as educators, what can we do to maybe help students kind of think about ways in which they can regulate their motivation as well? So the scene might be familiar to you. It might be a reflection in the mirror, perhaps, but sometimes we're bored, right? Like I said, we're not interested, we're not inclined to want to engage in whatever task might be before us. Or even when we are working through something, maybe we're not fully motivated, right? We really don't want to persist in the task that we're in. And there could be a lot of different thoughts going on in a situation like this, right? So imagine the student, it could be yourself, it could be someone you're working with, and they might be saying, I can't do this, right? I think that's a very reasonable and kind of commonplace sentiment, right? I don't have the confidence to really tackle this. Maybe it's, I don't want to do this, right? I don't see any meaningful reason for why I should be engaging in this. Why am I doing this, right? What's the purpose for this, right? You might be questioning that. And there might be different things you might want to be engaging in, right? I want to do something else, right? And these are just a sampling of just 4 thoughts. But the point I want to drive home here is that motivation is multifaceted, right? It's not just I'm motivated or I'm not. It's quite complex, actually. There's different flavors, there's different dimensions to when we think about motivation. Motivation is also dynamic, and I think both educators, learners, and sometimes scholars kind of have a relatively static view of motivation, right? I'm a confident learner, right? Well, are you confident in every subject, in every task? There could be some variability there with how confident you are. Or I really like school. Well, do you always like school? Like, what about during testing? What about during homework, right? Like, is every single situation and is every single topic and subject going to be the same? Even listening to what I thought was an amazingly engaging lecture from Jeff, there might be some ebbs and flows, right? Where you're like, oh, this is really cool. Or like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure, right? So there could be some dips even in a given 20-minute period, right? So there's a lot of fluctuations, there's a lot of dynamic changes going on with motivation. So let's think about motivation then as something strategic too, right? In the field of self-regulation, many scholars have thought about ways in which learners can regulate things, right? They can regulate their thinking, they can regulate their thought processes, right? So things like metacognition, where you're thinking about your thinking, right? So you are regulating your cognition. We also regulate things like our behavior, right? We're monitoring the physical things that we're doing. But we also can regulate our motivation, right? That's an aspect of self-regulation that we could actually implement strategies to actually enhance and initiate and sustain our motivation. So, question for all y'all on the chat, just write down the first thing that comes to your mind. What do you do to motivate yourself? And we'll just think of it in an academic context, right? So let's say you're working on a task for an assignment or you're studying for a test. What would you do to motivate yourself? So just on the task, on the chat, just write down the first thing that comes to mind. And I'm waiting to Zen 10. Learning. Okay, there's great things in the chat. There's incentives, there's deadlines, music, study partners, thinking about the value, keep them coming, right? A lot of different techniques here. And we can go through each one and maybe kind of line it up with a theoretical orientation. But you see here that there is a diversity of strategies that we can do, that we can employ to motivate ourselves. So keep them coming, but for the sake of time, I want to move into what educational psychologists have called this area, and they've called this area motivational regulation. And these are the procedures, many ones that you've listed here, that are used in a purposeful and willful manner to influence motivation. It's a purposeful attempt to influence your level of motivation. And we see the diversity of strategies here, and some scholars in this area have kind of delimited and kind of categorized the types of strategies. And this is not exhaustive, but I think these are 6 kind of major categories of strategies that learners can use. So things like mastery self-talk, performance self-talk. We often hear this a lot in like the athletic and the sports psychology realm, right? They're kind of, athletes are kind of hyping themselves up, kind of psyching themselves out when they're doing something anxious maybe, right? So they're engaging in self-talk, right? We can do this similar type of strategy in learning. We have things like self-consequating. We have things about regulating our valuation, value regulation. Like Jeff was saying, thinking about, what's valuable to me, like what values I hold. Efficacy enhancement and environment regulation. So I'm going to go through each one of these, and I want you to pay attention to which one you resonate most with. Okay, so maybe think about, oh yeah, I could see myself doing that, or oh yeah, I definitely do that, or no, that's not really me. So take a look at these 6 and we'll walk through each one. So self-talk. The first variant is mastery self-talk, and it's strategies like reminding yourself or telling yourself about your goal to learn and develop competence, right? So you might be struggling to get to your textbook and you're just like, okay, I'm going to do this because I'm going to learn something cool, or I'm going to learn this because I'm really going to master what's being taught for this class, right? And so you kind of remind yourself of your goal for learning, right? We're all lifelong learners, so you might be wanting to remind yourself, yeah, this is what I'm doing, and I want to remind myself of that goal. The other type of self-talk is performance self-talk, and there's 2 kind of common variants just within this category as well. So this is also reminding yourself, or also telling yourself different messages, but rather, instead of the goal of developing your competence, you may have a goal of showing or displaying your competence, right? So you might be saying, oh man, I really don't want to study today, but I need to get this done so my instructor can praise me or can recognize me as a good student. Or maybe you have a similar type of self-talk, but maybe it's a little bit more negative, right? It's actually framed negatively, right? So it's, oh, I need to get this done so I don't look bad in front of my friends, right? I don't want them to be like, oh my gosh, you got an F on your test, like, oh my gosh, right? So we may be thinking these messages to ourselves and using that as a strategy to actually get motivated. So scholars call the first type performance approach, where you're like, yes, I want people to recognize me, and that's why I'm going to do something. And the second type is called performance avoidance, where it's like, I just don't want to look incompetent. The third category of strategy is self-consequating, and I saw some different ones on the chat earlier about rewards and incentives, and Jeff alluded to extrinsic rewards as well. But this is a strategy that I like to do a lot for myself. I'll promise myself a reward when the task is completed. Like, I'm gonna get a scoop of ice cream. I'm in Texas, so it's still like 94 degrees today, so it's really hot. So I might say, hey, after I finish, this class, or after I finish this homework assignment, I'm gonna get ice cream, and that's gonna like keep me motivated to kind of get through this. Or after I finish my homework, I get to watch 20 minutes of TikTok videos, and like, yes, like I'm gonna get there, right? So you might be rewarding yourself or promising rewards as you're engaging in this task, or you might be promising yourself like the lack of punishments, right? Like, okay, I'm not going to be able to enjoy this, right, if I don't engage in this, right? So you might be also thinking about potential punishments as well. There's also value regulation, and there's a couple ways to engage in this type of approach. One way that I think Jeff was alluding to in the chat was thinking about your interests, thinking about your values, and kind of actively making connections about those things. So maybe you're really into photography and you're like, oh my gosh, this whole thing about light and physics in this chapter, oh my gosh, it totally relates to photography. Like, this is so cool. Like, I'm going to think about how this applies to my hobby as I'm reading this chapter, because that's going to get me through this. Also, there's ways to enhance the interest, the situational interest in the task you're engaged in. And so you can try to make things more fun, things that are mundane. You can try to make it into a game. You can make it more exhilarating. And so maybe you'll say, okay, there's 20 problems here. I'm going to time myself to see how quickly I can get through them. And let me see if I can beat like a personal time, right? And so you kind of gamify the situation, and you enhance the interest and the fun and the enjoyment of the task you're engaged in. Two more left. We have efficacy enhancement. And this is where you're reminding yourself of your capability, right? Like, I got this. But you're also doing something called setting proximal goals, or you're breaking down a task, right? And so oftentimes I try to help students I work with when there's a big task, like you're writing a 5-page essay. You're like, oh my, like that is like really long. I don't know about that. I really don't want to try that. But then you break it down, right? You break it down and say, hey, let me just start with the intro paragraph. It's just 5 sentences. Okay, yeah, I can handle that. Like, let me just start there, right? And by breaking down those goals, you're able to feel more confident. You're like, okay, the 5-page essay seemed daunting, but I think I can manage, just writing the first paragraph, and I'll start there. So you're enhancing your sense of efficacy towards doing at least a smaller task, and hopefully that can kind of cascade and integrate our confidence as well. And then the last one is environment regulation, right? Making your environment less distracting, right? So turning off a device or putting it in a different room, right? Because we know how distracting our phones can be, for instance. Or maybe you say, I'm going to study in a more conducive environment for learning. I'm going to go to the library for 2 hours, because that's where it's less noisy and there's less temptations there for me to sleep or veg out or watch this video, etc. Right? So these are the 6 kind of broad categories of strategies. And like I asked you, think about which one you use the most. And we actually have a Zoom poll that we can hopefully launch now. And I want you to vote. I'm sure you might use multiple of these, but pick the one that you think you use the most. So we have mastery self-talk, performance self-talk, self-consequating, value regulation, efficacy enhancement, and environment regulation. Okay, maybe about 5 more seconds on the poll. Okay, I don't know. Can we reveal the answers? Okay, so hopefully y'all see it. I know I see it popped up on my window. It's a pretty good spread, actually. That's pretty interesting. It seems like the most is efficacy enhancement with about 33%. The rest are around the 20 range, with self-talk, self-consequating, environment regulation, and then slightly lower is value regulation. So, okay, so we have a good smattering of strategies here. So, so you might be wondering, okay, there's different types of strategies. We got that. You might be wondering, which one is the best? We conducted a meta-analysis, and I had my co-authors on the first slide, but a team of us at Texas State University, as well as MEF University in Turkey, and Yeon Kim at Florida State University, we engaged in this meta-analysis, and it's a research synthesis. So we're scoping all the studies. We're trying to find every single paper that dealt with motivational regulation strategies. And we wanted to see what different correlations, what different associations they had with a bunch of different variables, things like grades, things like effort expenditure, self-efficacy or your confidence towards learning, how much you value what you're learning, as well as different types of self-regulation strategies, like the more cognitive strategies like metacognition, and things like behavioral regulation, things like time management, right? So we really wanted to see, okay, are these strategies like linked with different types of variables, and are there differentiation between these strategies, right? So we can kind of figure out, hey, which motivational strategy seems to be most highly associated with some of these other variables. So drum roll, please. The winner is, well, it depends actually. It's actually complicated, right? It's not a clear picture from our synthesis and from the literature at large, which strategy is best. We took an approach where we wanted to look at these distinct strategies. There is a lot of literature that have kind of positioned this work as like kind of broad motivation regulation strategies. Like I can, in general, motivate myself, but we wanted to look at these 6 kind of distinct categories of strategies. And when we did that, we actually found that no single strategy came out as kind of the clear winner, right? And this actually pointed to this idea that we actually need multiple strategies, right? Multiple of these strategies, if they're kind of equally associated with some of these outcomes, then it's worth trying them all, right? I will say that all the associations, I'm not gonna show all the numbers here, but all the associations were positive, right? They were all positive. So using these strategies seem to be correlated with a lot of those variables that I showed. But, and to another point, we actually also looked at the correlations among the strategies themselves, right? So is mastery self-talk correlated with performance self-talk? And is mastery self-talk correlated with value regulation, right? We did all the intercorrelations among all the strategies, and they were surprisingly pretty high. So we also saw that people are using, maybe like some of y'all are using strategies at the same time simultaneously, right? So you might be working on a task and you might be telling yourself different self-talk messages, right? There might be mixed messages. You might saying, hey, I want to learn this, and I also want to show my friends I can be pretty smart at this too, right? So you might be engaging in multiple strategies at the same time. What we did find overall, though, while there wasn't a clear winner, there were kind of clear-ish losers, right? So out of the 6 or so categories that we looked at, these 2 seem to be at the lower end of the pack. Kind of looking at almost every variable, these ones seem to be the least correlated with each of those variables. And so we were talking about the self-consequating and the performance avoidance self-talk. Right. So this is the version of performance self-talk where you're like, I'm going to remind myself that I don't want to look incompetent, right, in front of other people. Telling yourself those messages, as well as doing the kind of rewarding self-consequating. Once again, still positive, but very small and very modest associations with a lot of these outcome variables that we care about, like grades, effort, motivation, and other regulatory strategies. So we need multiple strategies, so use them, but also maybe de-emphasize these 2 that don't seem to be doing the best, right? They're not detrimental per se, but if there's other strategies that seem a little bit better, maybe prioritize those. My last slide is just a word of caution. A lot of this talk is focused on students, learners motivating themselves, but we don't want to cast all the responsibility and maybe even all the blame, quote unquote, on the learners, right? They're not fully responsible, and there's so much we can do to create, as educators, motivationally supportive environments, right? Learners are thinking about their motivation, and they might be expressing different things about their motivation, and learners and educators can kind of adapt their environments to try to do these same strategies, really, but actually put it in the onus with the educators. However, I would say learners aren't always in supportive situations, and oftentimes they're not in their educative environment, right? They're at home studying, they're in the library doing homework. And so there is a time and place for these strategies. And so I just wanted to mention that, because I feel like it's tempting to be like, okay, well, students have these strategies now, they got to figure it out themselves. No, I think what's really exciting is actually when they work synergistically, right? When learners can think about ways to improve their motivation, and educators are also thinking about this way, like, to me, that's a really like powerful combination that can work dynamically across different contexts. So thank you so much. We're really excited about this work, and hopefully it should be coming out soon in the Journal of Educational Psychology. And thank you once again for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fong, for that really interesting talk and that really helpful summary of these different strategies that students, ourselves, and the students that we're teaching might be using. We have 10 minutes or so for questions for Dr. Fong. I imagine there are several. I will turn it over to you, Dr. Fong, to kind of call on students who are raising their hands, and I can pop in if that's helpful. It looks like Julie will start us off.
Hi there. Sorry again, next to a friend. So one of the things that I've been doing is working with teaching pre-service teachers, and I'm wondering, like, do you have any advice on how to help teach early career teachers how to incorporate this into their, because students don't automatically self-regulate. So how can you help them learn to do that, in your classroom, or at least help them start to learn if they don't have, full control?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's been some kind of initial work being done on how to maybe teach some of these strategies. I think a lot of it comes first with what some scholars have called meta-motivational monitoring. So just making those we work with, learners, educators, have them be aware, right, that motivation is dynamic, motivation changes. Even just reflect on your own day. You're going to be like, wow, there were parts where I was like really jazzed up, and there are some parts where I was like dozing off because I was totally disengaged, right? To me, that's a very automatic reflective thing, right, that we do. But just to know that, like, motivation isn't just going to be the static thing that we always experience the same every day. No, there's so many twists and turns. And I think starting with the fact that, okay, like, there's going to be changes, I think is a very first kind of initial step. And then once you have the monitoring down, then you can think about the control, right? And I think what's really neat, and what's really kind of this kind of burgeoning area in this work, is kind of matching the type of maybe motivational decline with the type of strategy, right? So and so once again, kind of thinking about, okay, like, I'm feeling really disengaged because I don't value what I'm doing, then that's where the value regulation strategies come in. Or, hey, I'm unmotivated right now because I don't feel like I can do it. Well, then maybe the efficacy enhancement or maybe the mastery self-talk might come in handy there. So really, like, matching the situation with the strategy, I think, is a really exciting way to, once again, building the awareness and then kind of matching the strategy. So I don't know if that exactly addressed the question, but I think those are some ways to get it more concrete for folks. So Caitlin.
So just kind of along that same line, I wanted to ask, well, I guess you kind of answered it, but I also would know, like, I want to know how would teachers be able to kind of model this to their students so they can actually practice that self-regulation to be motivated in class? Because I feel like this is one of the things that's a little bit more harder to model. Because I can think of other stuff where it's like, you know, if you're teaching a lesson, you want to teach them how to annotate, that's something you can model very easily in class. But like, I feel like this is something very hard to model for students to continue to do.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, and I agree that a lot of the motivational regulation stuff isn't like observable, right? Like you don't like vocalize your self-talk, right? It's actually sub-vocalized, right? It's what you say to yourself, like in your head, right? So you're often not like sharing these things to the watching world, right? So so that's a really good question. I think I need to think about that one a little bit more. I think you could do a little bit of the modeling. It might be a little weird, but I often tell like a lot of stories when I teach, right? I talk about situations I find myself in. And so oftentimes with graduate students, I'm like, hey, you know, like I had to write this paper and it was due on Friday night. And I was like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to work on this. But here's what I did. Like, here's what I did to kind of get myself in the right mindset, get myself in the right situation that really paid off, right? And so maybe you can't always outright model it because often it is kind of this sub-vocalization. But I think telling stories, I think that could be one way to kind of get people to think, oh, wow, okay, there are different things I could try.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a question from Sunera in the chat, which is, would it be possible to theorize that if educators taught students from a younger age to be more aware of these regulation techniques for motivation, their ability to grasp complex concepts and store those concepts in long-term memory would increase? So just to frame that a little bit, is the outcome that you were looking at is achievement outcomes, or are they motivation outcomes? And is there any developmental trends that you were finding in the complex set of results that you were alluding to?
Yeah, so we looked at a lot of outcomes. I guess that's the problem I often put myself into. But yeah, we looked at grades, we looked at motivation outcomes and other kind of regulation type outcomes. I think one distinct pattern that we saw was that associations with grades, those were much smaller than with associations with other motivation and other regulation type variables. So we're kind of operating with a hypothesis from other scholars as well that these motivation regulation strategies probably aren't directly affecting grades, but they're indirectly affecting grades via some of these other variables, via things like increased effort, via things like more sophisticated cognitive strategies, right? So you're like, okay, I'm going to engage now because I'm getting into a less distracting environment. And now that I can focus, I can really do some greater elaboration and organizational strategies now, right? So yeah, we're definitely seeing kind of maybe like a pathway to maybe using these motivation regulation strategies to kind of unlock, right, different motivational states and different regulatory strategies that can in turn hopefully lead to higher performance, right? So and the question about developmental trends, yeah, we actually are seeing some not only developmental trends, but also like country of origin, like region of origin differences as well. And so thinking about developmental context as well as cultural context seems to be at play here, with some strategies being more related to increased motivation depending on age, right? So the salience of extrinsic rewards seems to be for now seems to be kind of more salient for certain age groups and even culturally as well. Like we found some moderation by cultural context. And so this, by no means, I don't think is kind of this universal pattern by age or kind of region as well.
Thank you. There's a question from Lewis. What advice would you give for someone who struggles to keep motivation consistent and keeps falling off after a short period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to the main takeaway from this is the fact that there's multiple strategies at our disposal, I think is really empowering, right? It's like, hey, I don't have to keep trying the same thing I've been doing to keep myself motivated consistently, like you mentioned. So really seeing that motivation is dynamic, complex, multifaceted is at times frustrating, but at times really exciting, right? There are different types of things we can try. And so if you're saying, hey, I'm trying this thing, I still am demotivated, hey, there's 4 or 5 other strategies that you can try. You can use them in different combinations, right? You can do a little bit of, gamifying the task to make it more interesting in combination with some mastery self-talk, right? Or you can break down a task into smaller pieces, into smaller sub goals, and then also pair that with, some performance approach self-talk, right? Get yourself amped up to really tackle those smaller chunks. And so to me, there's a mix and match. There's a, buy one, get one. Like there's different combinations that you can do with these strategies.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes remaining. Are there any other questions? And I think at this point we can open it up to questions to Dr. Green as well. If there's anything that wasn't addressed from the first Q&A. I'll wait 10 seconds. It has been a real privilege to share your wisdom with the students at Queens College and anybody who's joining us outside of that or is watching the recording later. Dr. Fong, Dr. Green, thank you very much for taking the time. I know that our students appreciate it. I appreciate it. Dr. Benvenuti is appreciative as well. As we're signing off here, I'd love for the group to give any kind of interpersonal feedback to our presenters. Say something in the chat, unmute yourself and say goodbye as you're signing off. Use a emoticon. But do give some feedback because I think we're all very appreciative of your time and sharing your expertise. So thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll stop the recording shortly. Thanks so much.